On a cold morning in March of 1966, in a factory in Hamilton, Ontario, a turquoise sedan rolled slowly off the assembly line. A few workers stood and watched. Someone took a photograph. Then the line stopped, and it did not start again. That car was a Studebaker. It was the last one anyone would ever build. The company that made it had been putting vehicles on American roads for 114 years. It had built wagons for the Union Army and carriages for Abraham Lincoln. It had survived the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression. And then, in the span of a single decade, a company that had outlasted almost everything simply stopped. Not bankrupt overnight. Not bought and broken up. Quietly closed by the men who owned it. Here is the part that has bothered people for 60 years. In its final years, Studebaker was not building bad cars. It was building some of the most advanced cars in America. It had disc brakes before Detroit did. It had a fiberglass coupe that set speed records out on the salt flats of Utah. It had engineering that the giants would not match for years. The product was not the problem. So what kills a company that still knows how to build a great car? The answer is not in the showroom. It is in the account books and in a quiet decision the men at the top made about what business they actually wanted to be in. To understand the ending, you have to go back to a blacksmith shop. In 1852, 2 brothers named Henry and Clement Studebaker opened a forge in South Bend, Indiana. The country around them was still mostly farmland. Abraham Lincoln was a railroad lawyer in Illinois. The Civil War was almost a decade away. The brothers shod horses and repaired wagons, and before long, they began building wagons of their own. 3 more brothers joined them. They were the sons of German immigrants, and they shared one conviction that would define the company for a century. Build it well, and build it to last. It worked better than anyone could have guessed. By the 1870s, Studebaker was the largest builder of wagons and carriages in the world. Not in Indiana. Not in the United States. In the world. When the Union Army needed wagons to haul supplies through the mud of the war, many of those wagons came out of South Bend. When the President of the United States needed a carriage, Studebaker built carriages for Abraham Lincoln. Farm wagons, freight wagons, fine carriages for the wealthy. If it had wheels and a horse in front of it, there was a good chance the Studebaker name was stamped somewhere on the frame. By the height of the wagon era, the South Bend works sprawled across acres of brick and timber, and the Studebaker name meant something specific to the people who bought it. A Studebaker wagon was the one you handed down. Pioneers loaded them for the long roll west and trusted their families to the axles. Freight haulers ran them until the iron wore thin. The brothers had built a reputation on a single promise, that the thing would not fail you when you were 300 miles from the nearest wheelwright, and that promise became the most valuable asset the company ever owned. It was worth more than any building. In the end, it would outlast the buildings too. This matters because it tells you who Studebaker was when the automobile arrived. They were not desperate newcomers gambling on a strange new machine. They were the most successful builders of horse-drawn transportation on Earth, and they watched the gasoline engine with the calm of men who already owned the road. They moved carefully. In 1902, Studebaker built its first electric car. In 1904, its first gasoline model. By 1912, the company had committed fully to the automobile, and it carried its old philosophy straight into the new century. While Henry Ford chased pure efficiency and General Motors bought up rival after rival, Studebaker found a different place to stand. It was not the cheapest car on the market. It was not the most expensive. It was the well-made one. A Studebaker was for the man who wanted something better than a Model T, but could not see himself in a Cadillac. Honest engineering at a fair price. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, that formula kept Studebaker among the respected names in American automaking. What set the company apart in those years was an engineering pride that ran deeper than fashion. Studebaker engines had a reputation for toughness. Studebaker bodies were known to be square and solid. The company sold to doctors and shop owners and farmers who had done well, People who wanted a car that announced quiet success rather than loud money. It was never the flashiest badge on the lot. It was the sensible one, the dependable one, and for a long stretch of American history, sensible and dependable was exactly what a great many buyers were looking for. The first crack appeared in 1933. The Great Depression had gutted the car market, and even a careful company could not escape it. Studebaker slid into receivership, a kind of supervised bankruptcy, and for a while, it looked like the end. It was not. The company reorganized, brought in new management, and clawed its way back to solvency. But something had changed in its character. The men who ran Studebaker after 1933 had seen how fast the ground could open beneath them. They became cautious. They guarded cash. They flinched at the kind of large, expensive bets that the industry would soon demand. That caution had saved them once. Over the next 30 years, it would help bury them. Then came the company's finest hour. During the Second World War, Studebaker turned its plants over to the war effort, building trucks for the army and aircraft engines for the bombers crossing the Atlantic. When the fighting stopped and America wanted new cars again, most of Detroit was still bolting together warmed-over pre-war designs. Studebaker did something bolder. In 1947, months ahead of the giants, it released a car that looked like it had driven in from the future. The man behind that look was Raymond Loewy. Loewy was not an automobile engineer. He was an industrial designer, the kind of man who could shape a locomotive, a refrigerator, and the red and white Lucky Strike cigarette package and make all of them feel modern. His 1947 Studebaker Champions and Commanders were low, rounded, and aerodynamic, unlike anything else parked on an American street. People joked that you could not tell whether the car was coming or going. They also bought it. For a few golden years, Studebaker was the most talked about brand in the business. The shape was so radical that it changed how people argued about cars at the dinner table. Some buyers loved the clean low lines and the wraparound rear glass. Others could not get used to a car that seemed to point in both directions at once. But almost no one ignored it, and in the years right after the war, attention was a currency Studebaker could spend. Dealers could not get enough cars. The company that had been quietly competent for half a century was suddenly the daring one, the brand that had read the future before Detroit bothered to look up. In 1950, Studebaker sold more than 320,000 vehicles, the best year in its history. It had cash in the bank, a name people trusted, and a plant in South Bend that employed thousands of skilled men, many of whose fathers had worked the same floor before them. If you had stood on that factory floor in 1950 and told the men around you that the company would be dead within 16 years, they would have laughed you out of the building. So what happened? The collapse did not begin with a bad car. It began with arithmetic. Studebaker paid some of the highest wages in the automobile industry. Its union contracts were generous. Its pension promises were large, and for years, none of that was a problem because when you are selling hundreds of thousands of cars, you can afford to take care of the people who build them. But fixed costs have a cruel habit. They do not shrink when your sales do. And in the early 1950s, the sales began to shrink. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler came out of the war as giants, and they fought for the market with everything they had. They cut prices. They restyled every single year. They flooded the showrooms with cars that were bigger, flashier, and often cheaper than anything a smaller company could match. Studebaker, the firm that had beaten everyone to market in 1947, suddenly could not keep up. Its plant in South Bend was old. Its costs were high, and its profit on every car grew thinner with each passing season. The numbers behind that pressure were merciless. A giant like General Motors could spread the cost of designing a new car across millions of sales, so each vehicle carried only a sliver of the bill. Studebaker had to spread that same kind of cost across a small fraction of the volume, which meant every Studebaker quietly carried a heavier burden before it ever left the lot. The company could match Detroit on engineering. It could not match Detroit on scale, and scale was the part that paid the bills. Every year the gap widened. Every year the giants grew a little stronger and the independents grew a little more tired. There is an old argument about who was to blame, and it is never fully settled. Some say the unions pushed too hard, that the wages and pensions Studebaker agreed to were more than a company its size could ever carry. Others say the men in the front office signed those contracts willingly in the good years and then refused to modernize the plant that might have paid for them. Both sides are partly right. A small company in a business built for giants had almost no room for error, and Studebaker made its errors at the worst possible time. This was the moment that called for hard, painful choices. Instead, management reached for a shortcut. In 1954, Studebaker merged with Packard, another proud independent in serious trouble. The theory sounded reasonable in a boardroom. Two struggling companies combined might find the scale to stand against the big three. The reality was worse than either company alone. Packard turned out to be in even deeper distress than Studebaker, and the merger simply lashed two sinking ships together. By 1958, the Packard name was dead, and Studebaker was left holding the debt with almost nothing to show for it. A century of independence, and the company had just spent some of its last strength buying another firm's problems. You can hear the ghost of 1933 in that decision. A bolder company, one that had never been frightened half to death by the Depression, might have spent its money fixing its own factory instead of swallowing a dying rival. Studebaker chose the path that looked safe. The path that looked safe turned out to be the fatal one. And yet it kept fighting. This is the strange, stubborn heart of the Studebaker story. The harder things got, the more interesting the company became. In 1959, while Detroit was locked in a race to build the longest, lowest, most chrome-covered land yachts in history, Studebaker went the other way. It built the Lark. The Lark was small, plain, and sensible, a compact car for people who were tired of paying to park a living room in the driveway. It was exactly right for the moment. Buyers came back, profits returned. For one bright season, it looked like Studebaker had found the answer. It had. The trouble was that it could not afford to keep it. The big three watched the Lark sell, and within a year they rolled out compacts of their own: the Ford Falcon, the Chevrolet Corvair, the Plymouth Valiant. These were companies that could outspend Studebaker 10-to-1 on advertising alone. They had more dealers, easier financing, longer warranties, and far deeper pockets. The Lark had perhaps 2 good years before the giants simply buried it under sheer volume. A great idea was not enough. It never is. When the other side has the money, Studebaker still was not done. In 1962, with almost no cash for new tooling, it turned to the designer Brooks Stevens, who pulled off a small miracle. Working with body panels the company already owned, Stevens reshaped the aging lineup into something that looked fresh, including a sharp, elegant coupe called the Gran Turismo Hawk. And then came the boldest stroke of all. Under a new president named Sherwood Egbert, Studebaker handed Raymond Loewy one final assignment, and Loewy and his small team designed the Avanti. The Avanti was a fiberglass sports coupe that looked like nothing else in America. It was sleek, it was fast, and it was genuinely ahead of its time. It set a string of speed records on the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. It offered front disc brakes as standard equipment before any other American carmaker would. For a struggling firm and a dying plant, it was an astonishing thing to build. And it did not matter. The fiberglass bodies were hard to make. Quality problems and delays piled up, and by the time the company worked out the trouble, the excitement had cooled. Studebaker sold only around 4,600 Avantis in that first year, a beautiful car in numbers far too small to save anyone. This was the cruelty of Studebaker at the end. The disc brakes, the records on the Salt, the efficient new 6-cylinder engine, the clever restyling done on a shoestring. The engineering was alive and well. The business underneath it was already dead. Think about what that meant on the ground. The same company that could not afford to retool its factory had just put 4-wheel disc-stopping power and a record-setting body on the road. Its engineers were solving problems the largest corporations in the world had not yet bothered to touch. The talent on the floor in South Bend was first-rate, right up to the final week. What it lacked was not skill. It was a balance sheet that could pay for the skill. Because here is the part of the story that almost never gets told. By the early 1960s, the men running Studebaker had quietly stopped believing in cars. The company had spent years buying other businesses, appliance makers, part suppliers, even a chemical company, and those businesses earned money while the automobile division bled. So when the cash had to be divided, when it was time to decide whether to pour money into new cars and a modern factory, the money went elsewhere. The leadership had found a more comfortable place to stand, and it was not on the factory floor in South Bend. For the families in that city, this was the betrayal that mattered. Not a foreign rival. Not a single villain in a corner office. A slow decision, made in pieces over years, that the place which had built 3 generations of livelihoods was simply no longer worth the investment. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it is the kind of decision the people who built these companies never forgive. The Wagon brothers had believed the product came first and the profit followed. The men who held the company in its last years had reversed the order. To them, the automobile division was a line on a page that ran red, while the appliances and the chemicals ran black, and the math told them where the money should go. They were not wrong about the math. They were wrong about what they owed the place. And the families who had spent 3 generations on that floor could feel the difference between a company fighting to survive and a company that had already decided, quietly, to let them go. In December of 1963, the decision became final. Studebaker closed the South Bend plant. The work that remained moved north to a smaller factory in Hamilton, Ontario, where labor was cheaper and the machinery was newer. On paper, it was the efficient move. In South Bend, it was a funeral. Thousands of men who had given the company their working lives walked out through the gates for the last time, many of them too old to start again, some of them with pensions that would not survive what came after. The plant that had been the beating engine of the city went silent. For a city like South Bend, a plant closing was never only a plant closing. The company had been the largest employer in town for the better part of a century. It had filled the bowling leagues and the union halls and the church parking lots. It had paid for houses and weddings and tuition for kids who would never have to stand at a press. When the gates shut, the loss spread far past the men who lost their paychecks. The hardware stores felt it. The diners felt it. A whole web of ordinary life that had grown up around the steady rhythm of shift change began, slowly and then all at once, to come apart. The cars they built up in Hamilton were, by every honest account, good cars. The 1964 and 1965 Studebakers were handsome, solid, and reliable. To keep them running, the company even bought its engines from General Motors, including a 283 cubic inch V8 built in Canada by the very giant that had helped drive Studebaker to the wall. There is a hard kind of irony in that. But good cars could not fix the math. A company that had once built more than 300,000 vehicles in a single year was now struggling to build 20,000. There was no path to the scale that made the business work. Every car left the line at a loss. Every year the losses grew deeper. The Hamilton operation was a strange, sad afterlife for a great American name. The plant was modern and the workers were skilled, but it had been built for a small run of cars, and a small run could never carry the weight of a company that size. The dealers back in the States saw the writing on the wall and began drifting away to brands that would still be around to honor a warranty. A car is only as good as the network behind it, and that network was evaporating faster than any factory in Canada could replace it. On a morning in March of 1966, the last Studebaker rolled off the line in Hamilton, a turquoise cruiser. The final car in a story that had begun with a blacksmith shop and a pile of horseshoes. 114 years of building things that moved, finished in a quiet Canadian factory far from home. The company that had served a president, survived the Depression, and beaten Detroit to the future was gone. Could Studebaker have been saved? Honestly, probably not. At least not as the company it was. The American car industry was closing ranks. The cost of competing rose every year, And Studebaker was far from the only independent to vanish. Hudson, Nash, Thackard, Willys, Kaiser. One by one, the names that had once filled American roads went dark. Studebaker was not unusual in dying. It was only the last of its kind to go. But that is not the same as saying it had to end the way it did. The Packard merger was a choice. The refusal to face its own costs in the 1950s was a choice. The decision to starve the car business and feed everything else was a choice. The men at the top did not lose Studebaker to fate. They steered it toward the exit on their own terms and made certain that as a builder of automobiles, it would not survive them. And that is the lesson that still stings 60 years on. Studebaker was not killed by bad products or by ignoring its customers. In its final years, it was building some of the most forward-looking cars in the country. What killed it was everything wrapped around the product. The cost structure, the aging plant, the shrinking network of dealers, the simple, brutal arithmetic of fighting companies 10 times your size with money you did not have. You can build the finest car in America and still lose if the business beneath it does not work. Sometimes the race does not go to the best. It goes to whoever can outlast everyone else. It is a lesson that has nothing to do with horsepower or styling and everything to do with the cold structure underneath. The market does not reward the best car. It rewards the company that can keep building cars long enough for the next good one to count. Studebaker ran out of that time. Not out of talent and not out of ideas. Out of time. Sherwood Egbert, the president who had pushed for the Avanti and tried to drag the company back to life, never saw how it ended. He was fighting cancer through much of his time in the job, and he resigned in 1963. He died in 1969, only 3 years after the last car was built. Whether the strain of trying to save Studebaker took something out of him, no one can say for certain. But it is a quiet and fitting close to the story of a man who fought hard for a thing that could not be won. The Avanti strangely outlived the company that made it. A group of dealers bought the design and the tooling and kept building it under its own name, in one form or another, well into the 2000s. The car lasted longer on its own than it ever had as a Studebaker, and in South Bend, the name has not disappeared. You can still walk through the Studebaker National Museum where the wagons and the automobiles sit in the same rooms, the whole arc of the company under one roof. From the carriage that carried a president to the last car nobody could save. The factory is mostly gone. The name remains. And the men who built those cars, and the city that built itself around them, remember exactly what was lost. If this story stayed with you, you probably know someone it belongs to. A father who ran a lathe. A grandfather who drove a lark. A neighbor who walked out of a plant gate for the last time and never quite got over it. Tell us about them in the comments. Tell us what your family built and what it cost when the doors finally closed. The history of American industry does not live in the boardrooms that shut these places down. It lives in the people who still remember the smell of the floor and the sound of the line. Subscribe if you want to keep that memory alive alongside us. We read every comment, and we are listening.